Hey guys, what is up? Welcome to another Blender live stream. My name is Brandon Hicks. I'm a Blender Foundation certified trainer, and I am the owner and operator of the orangeguild.com. It is your one-stop shop for all Blender training and mentorship that you need to get leveling up on your skills. So tonight is going to be really, really sweet. I had intended to jump into more of the 3D illustration project that I was working on this month. But after a successful day of working with Substance Painter, with some of the new workflows between 2.8 and Blender, I wanted to share kind of a whole new workflow process for you guys that will get you up to speed on what to do in the current version of Blender, as well as the new 2.8 release coming out soon. So this is nothing new if you already are familiar with the Substance workflow, but it might be a nice review for you if you need something to kind of jumpstart your creativity there and help you with real-time graphics. So everything that we're talking about tonight will be applicable to VR, augmented reality type stuff, as well as game development for Unity, Unreal, things like that. And with the new Eevee rendering engine coming out in 2.8, you're going to be able to preview all of your real-time assets straight inside the 3D viewport, which is going to be really, really fantastic. So before we get started, I see we've got somebody in the chat. It's good to see you, Lorian. Thank you for stopping by once again and hanging out with me tonight. Anybody else that wants to chat throughout the stream, just let me know, and I'll be happy to stop and answer questions as we go. But until I see something, I'm going to press on. So let me show you what we're working on tonight. Also, I apologize if you hear any background noise. There's an event going on at the studio where I'm at tonight, and so you may hear some things in the background, but hopefully it's not too annoying or disturbing. So let's take a look. So tonight we are going to talk about how to create a basic asset like this in Blender and Substance Painter. And we may get a chance to touch up in Photoshop with a render. Not really sure if we'll get into that, but this is kind of an interesting thing that I was able to create in just a couple of hours this afternoon. So it's basically just a cube that's been beveled a couple of times and then brought into Substance Painter so that I could go ahead and add all these details. So you see we've got a lot of materials going on here. It's got several layers of dirt and grime and then rust into the material, and then you've got blood on top of that, and you can see it reacting in real time with the light as I rotate the environment around. So really, really cool. And again, with everything, it's something where you come in here with Substance, and the tools allow you to really just get into telling stories with your creative process. So that's what I really love about Substance Painter and Designer, is that they're really, really powerful, and they speed up this process. So let's talk about how we need to start out this process. I'm going to open up Blender 2.79b, and we're going to start with a blank scene here. And to get going, all we really need to do is start with a cube. I'm going to try to do something a little different than I did this afternoon so that we can play around with some different texturing. It won't be identical, but it'll be cool. So I'm just going to bevel this with a couple of cuts. And that's it. That's all I did. And then for the tools palette, I'm going to bevel that a little sharper there. For the tools palette, we just run over here in Shade Smooth. And then all we need to do is UV unwrap this really quickly. And the reason I'm using an object that's a basic cube is because it's really, really easy to UV unwrap. And what we're also going to be hopefully jumping into tonight, if we have time for it, is unwrapping some more of the objects from the other scene as well. So hopefully we'll get into some more UV commands if you guys are more interested in that side of the presentation tonight. Okay, so let's switch this over to the UV editor. We're in edit mode now. And for a simple cube, we can just do a smart UV project with the default settings, and that's going to project that in a flat layout for us on the 0 to 1 UV space. So once again, just like last night, we mentioned wanting to zoom in and check and make sure there's no overlapping faces or edges. And so this should be pretty good to go if you did an automatic unwrap on a cube. But as always, you want to jump in here, check out your stretching, make sure it's all blue, and you're good to go on a basic object like a cube. So that's all we really need to get going. Now let's talk about how to get this over to Substance. So I'm gonna go File, Export, and you can use an FBX or an OBJ, maybe Collada. I'm not really sure if it reads that, but I usually just use an OBJ. So I'm gonna select this, and then real quick, I'm gonna save this in our streaming directory. So let's jump into our Substance workflow, and we are going to save this as cube2. So grab selection only if you've got anything else in your scene. Make sure that's turned on, and the rest of this should be good to go as is. So don't worry about that. Set export, and that should export pretty quickly if it's just a cube. So now we can jump over to Substance Painter and take a look at how to start off our new project. Now, for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to be showing you the metallic rough PBR workflow. I'm not going to get a ton into PBR theory. There's going to have to be a whole separate, night or course on PBR if we're just going to talk about the theory side of it, because it's way too involved to talk about in one sitting. But for the purposes of your reference, personally, just know that we're going to be using the metallic rough workflow tonight. So let's jump into File. Let's create a new project here. And we're going to select the metallic rough workflow from right here, PBR metallic roughness algorithmic. Should be sort of in the middle. And then you want to change your normal map format to OpenGL because that's the one that Blender uses. And then you can set your document resolution at whatever texture size you want to work with. So I used a 2K texture size this afternoon. And then we're going to select our cube mesh that we just exported. So let's select cube 2. And that's going to load this into Substance Painter for us. And let's hit OK. And I'm going to go ahead and save my other project that was open. OK. So that's going to bring the cube into Substance Painter for us. So we have a blank cube. It's got a background already added that we can spin around and all of that. And so if I need to do another primer on Substance Painter and some of the tools, we can talk about specific settings as we go. Just ask me questions. There is another live stream that I did earlier on the Spoon that has Substance Painter covered. So you can go back and watch that if I don't cover something here. But feel free to ask me any questions. So Lorian is asking, what does PBR mean? So PBR stands for physically based rendering. You'll also hear PBS, which is physically based shading. And it is a specific stylized workflow that is meant to mimic materials accurately by making things consistent in terms of reflectivity, Fresnel, and physical attributes on the shaders themselves. And it's a way to standardize how we build shaders as texture artists so that we're not just doing what I've been doing in Blender, which is building them from scratch and taking some artistic liberties. And so the reason this is really, really handy is if, again, I've talked about this before, but if you have a whole team of people working on a game and they all are creating textures simultaneously on different objects, and someone else is doing the lighting that is for one entire level, the lighting and the textures both react to each other simultaneously. And so if you've got a group of people that are trying to stay on the same page with what they're creating, they need a way to speak the same language. And that's what this workflow allows you to do. It allows you to simplify creative decision making so that you're not breaking the realistic reaction of the materials in your scenes as you're creating the materials and the lighting. And that way, you should be able, theoretically, to place a whole library of the same PBR type workflow materials into one project, and without having to tweak much of anything, they should all show up photorealistically and perfect. At least that's the goal. It doesn't usually work out that way, but it can get you closer than, trying to grab shaders from me and then someone else online and then someone else online. If you've ever done that with Blender, you know that everybody has in the past created their own materials from scratch in their own way, and we don't always all follow the rules in terms of mathematical correctness and things like that for reflectivity. on materials, and so that can break the system in a scene. Okay, so let's get in here and talk about what we need to do. Now, luckily on this object tonight, it's not complicated. We don't have any normals to mess with like we did last night. We talked about baking normal maps and all that stuff. And usually you would, if you're going to bake those, you'd bake those in Blender and you'd import them, bring them in. But tonight we're just going to paint a normal map straight in Substance Painter. So no need to worry about that. So once we have our cube inside of this, we can actually look at our shelf down here and take a look at all these menus that show us these different options we have for things like texture maps and materials and brushes and all sorts of things. And so we're going to go to the materials tab down here at the bottom. This has an entire list of materials that come bundled with Substance Painter right out of the bag. And so if you just hover your mouse over one of these materials, it'll pop up a little preview showing you kind of what that looks like. And that will give you an idea of what you're going to be applying to this cube. And so at any point in time, if you just left click on one of these, it should show up. At least it was earlier today. You can also drag this into your layer stack, which will apply this to your cube as well. Okay, so that's what it is. You have to have the layer selected. So once you've got this layer selected, you can then cycle through and it will automatically update what material is on this layer over here, which is really cool because you can kind of preview how that's going to look. As long as you've unwrapped your UV map relatively well, this should automatically kind of map these materials and smart materials onto the surface of your object without much effort. And so it's pretty cool, especially when you get into these, terrain-based shaders. You've got a lot of detail built into these. And so for our purposes tonight, we're going to want to build something that's like a crate or, a box or something that would be in an industrial setting. And so we need to start looking towards some things that are more metallic in nature. This is some chainmail, which is pretty cool. So you can see that just being completely tiled over the entire thing. So I think before what I used was some sort of, I'm not gonna be able to find it. There's so many materials in here. But we can play with doing something a little bit different than we had before. So this is sort of a science fiction type of aluminum material, which is kind of cool. And then you've got this plastic diamond, glossy plastic, and anything that's really glossy will let you see the reflections a lot when you're rotating the background. So to do that, I'm just holding shift and then right clicking and dragging, and that's just rotating my environment around. You'll also notice if you hold control or alt, all of these modifier keys will pop up little menus letting you know what you can do with those activated. So that's pretty handy as long as you're using Control, Alt, or Shift. But let's take a look at some other materials and see which one we want to go with here. So wood is a perfect example of something I was mentioning last night in terms of the desk that we were working on for the illustration. And how it might be easier to just texture this in Substance and bring this back over because they've already got some really good looking wood grain in here. So Lauren's asking where the environment came from, and it's bundled with Substance, so it's already included in the software. If you go over to your settings over here, there's a menu that will let you display your environment. So it's this top menu here under display settings. If you go down to the environment settings, environment map, and left click this, it'll let you change. And these are all bundled with Substance that comes with the software. So any one of these you want to pick, you can swap out what's in the background, and you won't really be able to see it unless you pick something that's really reflective. So you can see what the lighting is doing, but each of these gives you a slightly different look. Some of these are outdoors, and these are more like studio-based in a photography studio, with these black and white represent sort of like soft boxes and stuff like that. So you've got that. For something industrial, I would try to pick an environment that's sort of more industrial. So this is like a bus garage, which is more like kind of where we're going to end up being with our other material by the time we export this. So I think I'm going to stick with this one. And you can change a lot of other things like the exposure and whether or not shadows are showing. Typically when you're painting, you don't want to have shadows turned on because it can give you a distorted perspective of like your colors that you're picking and you're painting with. So you want to keep that off pretty much when you're actually painting your materials. But all the camera settings are also here, so you can change your field of view, aperture if you want to change depth of field, and all the things that you would typically have turned on during a game are down here. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can turn on and off, but I'm going to leave those off while we paint. And just know that this top button right here are the settings for your environment. Okay, so let's make sure we have something that we're happy with to get started. So if we pick a weird material, it's going to get hard to kind of paint this up in a way that's easy. Sorry, I'm just trying to come up with a game plan here for what we're going to do. All right, let's start with this. This is kind of cool. It's already got a lot of, texturing and stuff going on with this. So when you apply a material, it's basically just going to be a layer, and you'll notice that it's a paint bucket layer, which is going to fill the entire object with this material. And so any of these layers that you would add with this menu are going to be blank layers like they would be in Photoshop. So if we drag this above it, anything we now paint will be applied to this layer on top of the original material down here. So it's a layer stacking sort of system, and we can pick anything we want. And so even if I wanted to pick something that was completely unrealistic, like let's say gold here, and I want to paint on this layer, we can go to our brushes, grab any of these awesome brushes that come with the program. And then once we have a paintbrush, we can zoom in on the material here. And when we paint, it'll paint the material that I have selected from the materials tab. So you can see a preview of it up here in terms of what we're painting with and the brush type that we're using. And all the settings like you would have in something like Photoshop are also right here for your brush settings. And then you've got your material settings down here for all the channels that you're currently painting on. And so the way that Substance works is basically it allows you to paint on multiple texture channels simultaneously. So if we were to just look at individual channels, you've got base color, which is going to give you just the color of the material that is going to be painting on your surface of your object. You've got height, which is like a bump map in Blender. You've got roughness, which relates to how shiny or how smooth or how glossy a surface is. So this is like the glossy setting in Blender's shaders here. And so anything that's more white is going to be rough. Anything that's closer to black is going to be smooth. You've got metallic. Anything that's black is not metallic. Anything that's white is metallic. And so this is pretty much just a black and white map. And then you got your normal map. In our case, we're going to use normal height and mesh, which is the OpenGL normal, which you can see here. And all of these can be cycled through. If you hit C repeatedly, it'll just cycle through all of these and let you see them one at a time. Or if you hit M on the keyboard for material, it'll switch back to material. But these are all selectable right here. And if at any point you want to see all of your actual texture maps, you can jump into this menu up here. And you can toggle whether you just want to see your texture maps or whether you want to see both side by side. And again, when you cycle through these materials, it'll show you what these actually look like on your UV map based on your object that you imported. And so with everything laid out here, when I paint, it updates on the map down here on every channel. And so that's the real strength of Substance, is that it allows you to update your texture maps simultaneously instead of having to paint them one by one like you would have to do in Blender or any other program, Photoshop even. So I might leave this open so you guys can see what it's doing over here. And I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of this layer. Let's make a new one. So Lauren is asking, does Substance have skin textures? And yes, it actually does have skin textures. If you're looking for materials that are skin, I'm not sure if there's any bundled. No, there's not. There is a, on the Substance website, you can be a part of their month-to-month program. And if you're just doing a monthly membership to get both Substance Painter and Designer in the membership, you'll also have access to an online library of hundreds or thousands of materials created by the community that you can download and put into your Substance install. And so you can download skin shaders there. It does come bundled with, if you look under the textures tab, it comes bundled with skin normals that you can use to create a skin bump on the surface of an object. So if we were to create a fill layer that kind of had a skin tint to it, like this, and it's not going to end up being super realistic, but let's just say that this is kind of close to what a skin texture looks like. And I want to create what looks like pores on the surface of a skin. Basically, I can grab a fill or a paint layer on top of this right here. And then what I want to do is under the normals section right here is I want to drop in one of these skin materials or skin normals textures that you see here. And so you can see like we have access to like all of the material settings here. You can turn these on and off. And each one of these, if it's outlined in blue, is going to be affecting the surface of the object as you paint on it. And so if you want to not affect anything but the color, you can turn all of that stuff off and just leave the color selected. And that way, when you paint, it won't affect the height of the bump or the normals or anything like that. But in our case, we want to just affect the normals. And so what we're going to do is take one of these and we need to drag it in, but I'm wondering if it won't let us because there's not a normal map there, which is weird. So that's typically how you would do it. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing the normal material pop up. Might be because I can't actually paint on this without a material being selected. So let's check. I've got a material here. Let's look back at our textures. Yeah, so typically you would just drag it in right here somewhere and it would let you drop it. So I'm not sure why that's not working. Anyways, so we'll come back to that and hopefully figure out a way to get this working. But that's how you would do it, and then you would be able to paint with the texture detail there. Okay, so for right now, let's take a look at changing this back to, I think, what does this need to be on? Oh, it's because I have this changed to normal. Okay, yeah. So let's change this back to something like this. And we'll take a look at what we want to do with this object. So what I did in the other one was I created some seams that were like welding seams down the side of that. That was all done in the normal map, which was kind of cool. But in our case, we may want to kind of play a little bit with what we have going on here and decide before we get started painting what we want this to look like. So it started off with a pretty interesting aluminum reflection material. And now is when we get to be a little creative and come up with a story for this asset and what we want it to do. So do we want it to be sci-fi? Do we want it to, is there going to be a lot of buttons and panels all over it? You know, what are we going to do with this? One of the things we can do if we don't like this sort of bumpy surface over the entire thing is we can play with just editing the normal on the surface. And so we'll turn all of this other stuff off and see the normal channels popping up on this right here. So that's a little weird that it's not showing up in the other scene. But then we can go to some of our tools, and you've got things like blur and a bunch of other things down here. And what's cool about this is that with this selected, we can basically add, let's say we want to, we could add a paint mask. Let's add a paint mask and see if this works. So I just want to affect the normals here. So if we jump over to the normal view, this should let you see what's going on here. But I don't want to show that while I'm painting. So let me see if that will work. Okay, yeah, that's not doing what I want. Let's instead paint with a brush. We'll play with the normal here and see what we can get going. Select one of these. Add a blank layer here. And I want to paint on normal. Okay, so that's not going to do what I want. So you gotta figure out how Substance works a little bit in terms of the way that the paint layers work, because it's not exactly the same as in Photoshop. Basically, you can add a paint layer to a existing material. In this case, remember this is just a fill for the entire thing here. And then once you have a paint layer down here, you can paint on this layer separately, sort of like a mask. And so now if we grab a brush and paint, you can see that showing up down there. And that's just changing the color based on the color that we pick here. So you can change the color, or again, you can select every single attribute here all at the same time, and it will change all of those all at once. And so if we just want to affect one of these, any one of these we can turn off, so it just changes that. And in this case, again, it doesn't look like we have a normal selected here that we can use. So what we would want to do is maybe grab another material that does have a normal section, and maybe we could play with some of the textures in there. Yeah, so under height, we can change this to a bumpy skin here and play with that. So you can see that getting added from this normal down here. So you have to have something with height or normal added into the mesh in order to drag those and drop those into the appropriate slots. Once you have that, you can change the spacing and all the things you would with a Photoshop brush, and might turn the flow down here. But now you can stamp on like skin textures. So that's how you would do that if you were trying to paint a human. So yes, you can do skin textures. Long way around showing you how to do that, but it is possible. The other thing this comes in handy with is if you're trying to do hard surface objects. So we're talking a little bit about hard ops last night, and this is another way of doing hard surface details is by painting directly into the normal map, so you don't have to bake a normal. And so what we would end up doing here is grabbing one of these normal details that's been saved out separately. And then once we have that, so this is like a little screw that you can see here. I'm going to go ahead and grab a material that I want this screw to be made out of. So let's say it's iron raw here. And let's add a new layer. And then let's go back to our hard surfaces tab down here and grab a nut or a bolt or a screw. And we're going to drag this into the proper section of our material over here. Okay, so I'm going to start with a fill layer instead. And then I'm going to add a paint layer. Let's add a black mask so that nothing is showing. And then let's try this again. Okay. So now if we scale this up, you can see that we can place that in this section here, and it will depend on your brush settings. So sometimes you need to mess with the jitters and all that stuff and turn that off depending on what you have selected. And then you make sure your opacity's up, your flow's up, and that you're not, dragging and stuff like that, because that's not the way you would want to use these. Okay, so you got paint here, and you've also got a mask, which will do exactly what it sounds like. So if we start painting with these brushes to sort of unmask what's going on here, you can see that I've added this to the alpha, and it's not on the it's not on any sort of normal channel, so that's why it is not really stamping the way we would want it to. So let me see if I can figure out what we need to do here. Stencil will let us project this onto the model, and so if we play with the position here of the object, we can then paint and stencil this onto the object like that. So that's kind of an interesting thing there. But it's definitely not what I want. So let me once again go back here and see what the problem is. Okay. Let's add this. Pick something like galvanized, which is what these would be made out of. And let's take a look at this again. Okay, so these can be dragged into multiple channels, but they're not always going to be useful doing it that way. Interesting. Okay, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get that particular thing working right now, and I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but let's look at some other stuff here and see if we can get this in a better place. Okay, I think I like that one a little better. There's a lot of options in terms of things you can use down here. You've also got smart materials, and so basic materials will just apply them uniformly over the entire object. But if you want to do something that's already got a little bit more of a worn look, you can look at all of these other materials that are included as smart materials. And so this would basically turn this into some sort of camouflage object. So we drag this above and you can see what that does there. And so it saves you just a lot of time, you know, trying to get certain things done and in place before you can, you know, kind of get them worked up into a more interesting version. And a lot of these smart materials have masks and things that you can paint directly onto. So it just gives you something more interesting to play with. So we open this folder, you can see I can turn all of these sections on and off as far as these details, and play with all the settings in here for these. So pretty cool. All right. That's cool. Okay. Let's get rid of all these other ones. Play with this one a little bit. Take our base steel down there. Add a little bit of color. You can see all the dirt and or the other portions of this on here, which is kind of cool. Okay. So let's play with kind of what I did this afternoon. I'll show you what I did. There's a weld that you can see here, and you've got zippers for clothes and all sorts of cool stuff. But basically, with this, I just created a grab the tool here, and then make sure you have the right layer selected. And if you have one of these selected and it doesn't have a paint layer, when you click, it'll ask you to create a paint layer. And then when you do that, it should allow you to start painting with the tool that you're using. So if we zoom in here, make this the right size. I start dragging this down, you can kind of see what it's doing there. It's currently using this iron raw material instead of the same steel painted. So we would want to switch this over to steel painted as the source, and that way it matches what we have going on here. And then let's take out some of the saturation. Let's darken it a little bit. And I'm gonna switch this back to just the 3D view so I can look at this. Let's drag this down. Okay, so you can see the weld sort of brush appear right there. And now when you paint with it, you'll be able to see what it's doing. Just like that. So what I did was, there's a function you can use in Substance that'll let you draw straight lines. So you just start anywhere up here, left click, and then hold shift, and then go to your endpoint, and then left click again, and that will paint a straight line for you. So one of the things I want to do before we kind of hone in on what we want to do for this is make sure that all of our settings are dialed in the way we want for this material. Because right now it seems like it's a little dark, and I want to make sure that this is kind of showing up the correct way. So start here. Okay, yeah, that's just the lighting, but if we rotate around, you can see that changes a little bit as we... But I just went around each corner and just shift clicked to create these little weld seams, which was a pretty easy thing to do. So make sure once you click, you don't rotate, because that will kind of mess that up. With the box, this doesn't take very long, but you can imagine trying to do this for every seam on a robot or something. It would take a while, but a lot less time than it would take you to model it, that's for sure. So count your blessings. Okay. Let's make sure we get all the corners. And under normal circumstances, I would obviously spend more time thinking about the structure of the model and probably create more realistic geometry before we brought it over. But for tonight's example, this will kind of do for what we need it to do. You've also got like bullet holes, which is kind of cool. You can drop those in. So that's kind of a fun and easy thing that we'll get that in there. A lot of interesting stuff. So this is supposed to be fur of some kind. Not really sure what's going on there. This is frost. It's kind of cool. Metal stitches. Oil leak. That's cool. Yeah, I kind of like that. Let's play with that a little bit. So we could put these around the top, and it will automatically use physics to drop those down a little bit, which is kind of cool. And if we had a stack of these boxes, you could kind of see how that would get kind of messy depending on what's inside of these containers. But yeah, that's pretty cool. But again, this is one of the really cool things about Substance, is that it takes all of this sort of stuff and saves you time so that you don't have to do it by hand, which is nice. You can get real messy too, and just let the physics engine kind of take over for you. Okay. We do this a little bit on the bottom. If it's sitting on the floor of some, bus garage or whatever, it's going to get real dirty. So dirty up the bottom here. Okay. So one of the obvious things you also want to do is continue to add layers and layers of mud and stuff like that, depending on where you're going. The great thing about these materials is that when you apply them, it automatically changes the reflectivity of your object as you paint on. So if it's supposed to be wet or a really reflective surface, it'll do that automatically. So you don't have to go back and do that on your own. And I love that about it. So here's some procedural materials, which can help you got grunge and stuff here. So that's pretty cool. Let's grab a brush down here, play with the dirt, and I'm gonna add a fill layer. And this needs to be under the oil probably. So let's make sure we label this as oil. And I'm gonna take this and put it towards the top of our painted steel over here. In fact, let's just move this up above all of our steel painted layers here. Close that group. Check the time real fast. Okay, we got about 10 minutes to wrap this up. So let's add a new layer. And for this, Alpha is going to be using our brush that we have down here. And let's see, for the material, let us grab something that's dirty. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is going to be super appropriate, but we can try this. Let's see how this looks. Let's see here, it also affects the normal underneath the oil. So if we put this on top, it's going to be above, and that automatically changes for you, which is, again, really, really cool. I think I'm going to want to use just a basic color here. So let's pick something that feels kind of like dirt. And let's work with that. Gonna grab my eraser real fast. Let's get rid of everything there and kind of start over. Okay, so now it's just going to use that color, since we got rid of the material, to paint this dirt on top. Here's where, if we wanted to, we've got all of these channels now available. So we could actually grab a texture here and use one of these, or even a hard surface section, and start adding stuff in there as well. So let's say we add a new layer, and now we want to start using something that's got steel. So maybe steel rough. Look at the normal channel down there, and now we should be able to drag this into the normal channel. So let's get rid of the alpha. Go to our brushes, check the basic hard here, and then once again make sure that that normal is there. So now we should be able to stamp these in, and it will use that steel color material that we have right here. So that's how you would kind of put these screws and bolts in. Now this needs to go, again, underneath everything on top of the original steel layer. So you just zoom in, and then again, it's going to be under the oil. So this is how I added nuts and bolts to the other thing there. And what I also really like about this is that it's a non-linear type of workflow. So as you make decisions and you change your mind, you can always, your stack is live, so you can change your mind and make decisions as you go. And so what's great is, like, let's just say that at this point, I've got a layer and I want to do screws, and then I decide, well, okay, now that I see that, I want to add some more details into the side of this box over here, but I've already got dirt and oil and all that stuff. Well, it doesn't really matter, because you can just reorder all the layers here to, you know, kind of look however you want it to look. And then right above this, let's add another layer. Let's call this hard surface. And then let's grab another hard surface type of thing. So let's grab this vents, drag this under the normal section. That's going to replace that for us. Now, if we raise our size here, let's grab another material, and we might use like a plastic. So might use something like plastic grainy. That will stamp that in there for us like that. So if we want to lower the hard edges, that will feather that in for us. And so you kind of have to play a little bit to get things where you need them to be. But you can do that, and then might play with throwing the stencil in there as well and seeing what that does for us. So it looks like we would need to remove that there. Huh, interesting. I've got a lot to learn about Substance Painter, but let's talk about the workflow a little more. So yeah, let's go back to the normals. Let's grab like a vent under the normal circle here, and then take out the stencil. Okay. So that will add that in. I want it to look a little bit more natural than that. And so for the base color on the plastic, looks a little bright. So let's darken this up a little bit. Okay, it's getting closer there. And then the roughness might be a little high, so let's pull that down. That controls how shiny it is. You can control, this looks like that has a grid pattern embedded, so that controls how many vents that you're gonna see there. So you never know what you're gonna find. There's a lot of really cool options that you can see. This will change how metallic it is. So that's pretty cool. Let's take this down. I drop those in down here somewhere. And then we can just have fun kind of placing these all around wherever we want them to be. So one thing we might do is grab a big panel section, something big and square, kind of like this. Drag this into section here. And let's play a little bit with this alpha. If you hold Control and then left click and drag, it will let you rotate this into 3D space. So you can drag that in there. And then if you can't get it any higher in terms of the size, you can always type in a value over here. So I might go up to like 160. Go up here and then drop that in place. So you can see I added a panel on the side there. And let's say we want this to cover the whole side and be under the vents. So just add a new layer, drag that below, zoom out a little bit, and then let's do 180. There we go. Now the vents will be on top of that. Let's go 200. Okay, so put that on the side over here. I might mirror the same thing on this side. And I'm just left clicking to apply that. And then let's say, what do we have? We have this. So let's say over here, we want to apply something that looks a little different. So make sure we go down to the normals, replace that there. And replace that there. And then what you can do is grab like an alpha, and this is how I started doing decals on these surfaces. So again, remember this is going to be underneath all of the crud that's collected on top of this surface at this point. But let's add a new layer, call this decals, and then start picking some cool designs. And these are all included, again, bundled with substance. This is how I did the handprints for the blood and stuff. That's all there. They've got cool stuff like caution. You can see here. And once again, I would just get rid of the material, pick a good base color that kind of matches what you're trying to go for here, and then use this to kind of get it rotated into place. So we might lower those, just kind of stamp that in there. Do the same thing on this side. Might add some high voltage signs. And if you want to use a material instead of just picking a base color and going off of that, you can. You can also change how shiny and roughness and if it's metallic or not down here. For basic decals, you want them to be fairly towards the middle or rough, and you know, they're typically just painted or plastic. So throw that on there. But yeah, this is how you get a pretty basic game asset going fairly quickly. It took a little longer because I had some hiccups there in the middle again, but that's all right. So let's wrap up with something interesting on the top here. Let's pull up our size to about 150. Stamp that on. Now you're going to notice that it was super red in our preview, but then when we stamped it on, it went a little bit brighter than that, a little bit less saturated. And that's because, again, with the PBR workflow, it's reacting realistically to the lighting setup that we have here. And so this is the correct color. So it knows how to render that better than our eyes can just kind of guess. And as you rotate, you can kind of see the colors hues shifting on the surface there. So it is correct. And then what I did before was there's some buttons and things you can add in, which I thought was pretty cool. And I did a little bit of that. Might add in that vent. So let's play with that a little bit. Let's grab another. This will be down here in the hard surface section. We're going to grab another material. Make this metal. Might make this like a steel pure. And then under the section here, doesn't look that that's going to let us add in a normal there. So, because those channels aren't showing up, I think we're going to have to select Okay, that's interesting. So depending on what material that you select, it may or may not give you the channels that you need. So it doesn't look like it's letting me do that there. Let's try a material down here instead of there and see what we get. That one's got a normal. Let's grab maybe a smart material will do it. Not sure it'll let us use that in this section. Anyways, not sure if that's gonna work, but yeah. Oh well. Anyways, we got enough to work with here that we can play with it. I need to get in here and practice a little bit more substance before I do an entire tutorial just on all the ins and outs. But anyways, let's go ahead and save this. So I'm gonna call this cube 2. And let's say we're done. We're gonna show this in Blender now. So let's export this, or export textures. We're gonna make sure that we pick the correct file path here. So I'm gonna go to my substance workflow and select that folder. And then I wanna use the Blender output here. And the reason for this is because the normals map that it exports is the OpenGL version, which is more correct for how you're gonna need to use it with Blender. So luckily there's a Blender preset that's already included, and all you have to do is select that and you should be good to go. So set your file path, set that, and then hit export. It may give you some errors or warnings, but don't worry about that, just hit okay. And then we can open this back up in Blender. So our material now needs to be created. Let's go ahead and jump into a node editor. And I'm going to show you in 2.79 first, and then I'll show you in 2.8 how to do this. But we're going to create a new material. We want to swap out the regular diffuse BSDF for a principled BSDF. And this is the PBR Disney shader that's included now with Blender. So this is typically the shader you're always going to use if you're going to do a PBR workflow because it's made specifically to work with these maps. And then I want to import all of the maps that I just created for the cube that we just exported from Substance. So I'm going to add in a texture, multiple images, and then again, I want to make sure I jump to my folder here. I'm going to grab all of the maps using shift and left click that are part of the cube 2 maps here. I don't need height, so I'm going to get rid of that because we're going to use the normal map. And then I'm going to open those, and those are now all brought in simultaneously. So now all you have to do is really connect these to the proper channels. So base color is going to go to base color. Metallic is going to go to metallic. Normal here is one we don't need because we're going to use the normal OpenGL. So that's going to go down here. and then the roughness goes to the roughness. So one of the things I would do for everything except for the base color is change this to non-colored data, because we're not using color. It's Boolean values, black and white, and then normal maps, which are always non-colored data. So one of the things we need to do to connect to the normal here is convert this to a normal map. So we're going to go to vector, grab a normal map, connect these up like we always do. Make sure we have our correct UV map selected there, and then everything should be good to go. So now we can render this in Blender, and let's do this by creating a basic lamp, and we'll use an area lamp. Let's turn the size up to 2, rotate this like this. And I'm just going to set up a really simple 3-point lighting setup so that we have something to look at. Okay, so now let's make sure cycles is selected. We're going to turn on denoising. I'm going to add a camera. Point it at our cube here. Might even make this square so it's a little bit more easy to frame up here, and then we can start rendering. So I'm going to give that a second to start computing, and then we will kind of see what we need to tweak here. Okay, so you can see just out of the box, if we kind of look in the 3D viewport here, I'm going to border select so it's only going to render what's in the middle. You can see what the 3-point lighting is kind of doing here, and if I rotate around, you can see that it is showing all of our materials correctly. So now we can zoom in, and you see all of the little details and all the maps coming correctly. So this is a really easy way to paint textures using Substance in Blender, using version 2.8. And if you're frustrated doing the procedural workflow and you don't want to build your own shaders and cycles anymore, and you just want an easier way to do it, this is the best way to do it, is to stick to the PBR workflow. And now when you bring in tons of objects that have been textured in Substance using the same workflow and the same lighting setup, they will all match, and you should be able to drop tons of things in the same scene without a problem. So now that we've kind of gone over how this works in Blender version 2.79, let's talk about how this looks in 2.8, and it's going to look really, really cool. Okay, so that was a pretty simple setup. And to save myself a little bit of time, I'm going to just go ahead and save this file. And I'm going to call this cube 2. And remember what I said before about 2.8, you want to make sure that as long as the final version has not come out, that you're not mixing and matching your files between versions, because it's still buggy. So I'm going to save a separate version for each of these files. So I'm going to close this out. Now I'm going to open up my Blender 2.8 install. It's the alpha right now. And first thing I want to do before we kind of get into the scene from tonight is I want to show you kind of how the other scene turned out from before today. So if I show you the cycles render, you'll be able to see this is what cycles looked like on my test object in 2.79. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this up over on the side, and then I'm going to show you kind of what it looks like now in Eevee. So if we turn this on, you're not going to see the texture show up immediately. And if you close it up in your scene, you're going to notice this happens on the alpha because of a bug that's not updating in the viewport. And all you have to do is right-click an object and then kind of move it, and then it will update your textures for you. And so that's what you need to do. And now with all of the Eevee settings turned on, you can see that everything is live, shadows, everything is working in the same way it would in the game. And I've got quite a few of the settings kind of cranked up in terms of the samples, and we've got the flare and stuff happening here that you can see under the render preview settings for bloom. You check that off and you'll be able to kind of play with how the highlights are blooming on the edges. So if we zoom in on the handprint down here, place this over to the side. Now if I zoom in on that handprint, you can see how it is blooming, and you can play with these settings down here. Now bear in mind, as you play with these, it may crash your system, or not your system, but Blender may crash. So save often and make sure that you're kind of paying attention to that. But you can play with how much this is blooming with all of these settings down here. Change the radius and even the color. So if you want this to be more yellow, red, whatever you want it to be, you can play with that a little bit there. Intensity. And so that's pretty cool. But all of that is live. So this is exactly the same exact thing that you would get if you were inside of a game engine for your PlayStation, Xbox, whatever. And you can see with 2K textures that you can get pretty close without seeing things get a little pixelated. But the reflections are working fantastic. Shadows are looking good. And I've got 4 lights and then an HDR in the background rendering as well. All of this is live, so you can move and rotate everything. The shadows will update immediately, and it's great to work with. If you turn the overlays off, it's even cooler because it's exactly the same thing you'd see in the game. And so with this here, this is going to be a whole new way to work in terms of kind of positioning things and getting things in place as you're working on things. And yeah, I've had a lot of fun today just getting in here and kind of playing around with all these settings. So I would highly recommend doing that as well. And let's talk about how I set this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my Cube 2. So I'm going to open it and then I'm going to resave it as a separate file using a 2.8 reference. So when I open this, I'm immediately saving this again as a Cube 2 version 2.8. And that just makes sure that I'm not going to mix and match between versions. And now what I want to do is talk a little bit about what you might encounter as you're switching between versions here. So one of the things that is going to happen if you open up another file is that, again, your menus are going to flip around. So you want to make sure that if this is usually at the top and it's now at the bottom, you just remember you can flip this up at the top again. If you switch this over into rendering right now, it's currently set to cycles, so it's going to start trying to do that. And so what I would do is first make sure you switch this over to Eevee. And so let's hope this doesn't crash as it's trying to calculate what's going on. Cycles is quite a bit faster in 2.8. In terms of the updating, but Eevee is just obviously so much quicker at handling, and this is exactly what Eevee is meant to be used for, is real-time stuff like this. So that's why we're going to use Eevee. Okay, yeah, got a problem. Let's close. Oh, interesting. Still there. All right, so let's switch to Eevee. Now we switch over into our rendering, and you'll see that we've got a lot of things going on here. It's black and all sorts of stuff. And what I did before was I was using an add-on from 2.8 that allowed me to add in HDR backgrounds and all sorts of other stuff. But if you want to add these in on your own, you're going to need to kind of figure out how to do that over here. So what I would kind of recommend doing first is making sure that all of your textures are kind of connected correctly. They should come over without a problem, but it doesn't hurt to kind of get in here and check your file paths and make sure that those are all connected. You can switch into these settings over here and kind of see what an HDR would look like in the background using that. But you're going to notice as well that that's not going to give you all the details of normals and all of that stuff showing. So we need to jump into Eevee and play a little bit with these lights that we see in our world. So with the world background, you don't have the same settings here. You need to switch this to the world menu. You'll notice that it's by default setting this to a background that's pure black and all the way to 0, which is why we're not seeing anything. So if you turn this up and then turn up your background strength, you're gonna now see things start to show up, but it's obviously still not giving us what we want. So one of those things that we need to do is update our screen. Right click, move that, and that will update our textures now. To get a much better presentation, we're gonna need to use an HDR. So we could try to do that using the look dev preview here, which is gonna give us pretty much what we would wanna see in Eevee, but this is gonna use the built-in HDR that we don't have access to from this menu. So we would need to then go in, add in a texture that is an environment texture. You want to grab a environment texture that you already have, pull that in, and in this case, I can open up an environment texture that I was using before, connect that to the color input, and now that we'll use that for my background environments. So in the reflections, you can now see that showing up. If we look at this here, turn off the overlays, make that full screen, you can kind of see that updating there. And so you can see it looks way better here in 2.8. And I would highly recommend you guys get in here and just play with how this is looking. So you can add a plane there, and that's going to ground it a little bit more. And once again, everything's, you know, live and just fantastic. So with the overlays, it's kind of cool to be able, again, to show the wireframes on top of everything else that's here. So if you want to turn everything else off, you can do that. And, oop, I had a crash. There it went. But anyways, that's the process for getting things working in 2.8. So that is kind of what I wanted to talk to you guys about tonight. So let's jump back into Blender and take a look at some of the UV practices for the scene we're working on this month. And let's talk a little bit more about UVs. Okay, so I've been doing a little bit of scene cleanup. And before we get too much into this, I want to make sure I close out of anything that's going to take up too much room on my memory. But before we get too far into this, I wanted to do a little bit of cleanup. And so I've been going around the scene and trying to get my poly count down a little bit, and then starting to see areas that I can optimize a little more. And so I combined some of these objects into a single object. So what I've been doing is anything that has a mirror on it, I've been applying the mirror and then the solidify, and then this is a separate object, this handle, so that doesn't need to be there anymore. Now the subsurface I'm leaving alone. I'm not applying those because I want to make sure I still have the option to turn those up or down based on what kind of render that I'm doing. But this basically just gives me the option to only be left with the subsurf modifiers, which again can be globally controlled using that simplify option that we talked about last night. And so now with that turned on and my viewport set to 1, you're going to notice that my my face count will go down tremendously as I play a little bit with these settings. And so some of the poly count is due to objects like this that have not been retopoed and are going to give us some issues, but that still needs to be done. And so yeah, that's the kind of things we're looking at right now. So let's talk about some of the objects we still need to UV. Theoretically, we could UV all of it because we've already done the book here. The maps have been done. This needs to be reworked so we can get a UV map on that. And then I don't think we need to UV this, but we might need to. For that, we would need to retopo because this is really just kind of a mess right now. And yeah, I'm not sure we need that many polys. So might retopo it, might not. It just depends on how easy it would be to kind of work on that. This doesn't need the modifier, the screw modifier, so let's go ahead and get rid of that. And the solidify. One of the other things I wanted to do this afternoon was get in here and play a little bit with the overlaps. So anything that had sugar like pouring over on the edges, I wanted to grab those and just make sure I either moved them or I got rid of them because it is noticeable in the render. So little details like that may not seem like they make a difference, but someone will catch it and it won't be you. And so better that you do it now than to post it online and have somebody kind of rip you a new one for something small. So the pages are pretty simple. We talked about this before, but basically if you want to do a UV map, the easiest thing to do is when you're starting to create this sort of stuff, create a UV map when you get it done and it's flat on the ground. And so what I'll do for this one is I'll just duplicate it since it already has a UV map, and I'll just say reset the UVs. And so now, because even though it's relatively positioned, we can flatten this back out. And once we have this sort of in a good place, it'll be a little easier to UV. So we can rotate this here. And for most pages, it doesn't need to be perfectly flat because as long as you can project from sort of top down, Blender can flatten it out well enough. If it's got thickness at all, you want to be sure that you take that into account. In this particular case, we've got to solidify. And so what will happen here is anything that I paint onto this surface is going to end up showing up on the back too, because it is basically just copying the UV coordinates from top to bottom after the solidify gets applied. And so even though it has thickness, if you were to see any of the other side of this, you're going to see a mirror image of the texture on the backside. So usually that won't matter, but it can, depending on, if it's sitting on something that's reflective or whatever, you want to pay attention to that kind of stuff. And so what you can do to get a head start before you apply the solidify is go ahead and hit U, and then you can unwrap. And since it's just one surface with planes that are connected in a grid, it's going to unwrap relatively easily. And then what you can do is apply the solidify. Now you're going to have two sets of edges sort of sitting on top of each other. And now if you grab the edge over here, you can grab the bottom set and the loop all the way around the outside. Hit Control E and mark a seam. And then what you can do is, now that you've got that marked, you can jump into your UV preferences up here. Make this a little bigger so it's easier to see. And then you can, I had that option turned on from last night. So now when we select, if you look at your selects, you can pick based on seam. And so now it will only select the portion of the mesh that is in front or behind the seam that you just created. So if I hit L for select linked up here, it's not going to select any of the faces below. If I select L down here, it's only going to select the bottom faces. And so what that allows you to do is in the UV space, now you can move these out of the way. And now when you select everything, you've already got this kind of separated out. So if you want to paint a back to this, this 3D object, you'll be able to paint a back on this side. And then all you need to do is line these up side by side so that it's one continuous image all the way across. And that way in Photoshop, you'll have a pretty simple time getting these kind of lined up. And so what you would typically do is get them close right here. And what I will do is loop select one side, scale by 0 on the x-axis, scale by 0 on the x-axis over here, and then same over here. Now you want to make sure that when you're loop selecting, you're not going to select the entire thing all the way around, because if you do that, you're going to end up scaling towards the middle over here. So just make sure you're paying attention, and you can still obviously separate these like this. Once you've got them kind of lined up side by side, you can, let me get this lined up here. Once you have these rows selected, you can hit V, and that will automatically detect which side needs to be joined to the other side. It looks like we need to actually reverse and rotate this around so that it's matching up on this side, because it is not correct. So let's rotate this 180 degrees, move this over to the right side. And now when we line these up close and I hit V, you should see pairs of vertices in green lining up, letting you know that it's going to snap those together on top of each other and connect them. So if I left click and do that, it will connect those all together. Now, the reason that that disappeared is because it tucked this entire thing back under, and I don't want it to do that. So what I'm going to do is just join manually. So let's hit W, and we can choose weld, and that will join for us. So one of the things we want to do here as well is make sure that we don't have any of these UVs laying on top of each other. So let's make sure that this is not going to do anything weird. Okay, it looks like this is also flipped vertically. So we need to scale by -1 on the y-axis. So there we go. Now it's lined up. So now if we hit V, we should see those vertices line up. And if we join, there we go. Now it'll snap together. So once again, let's make sure we hit in, turn on our stretch, see that nothing is kind of broken. And now if we want to, we can scale these down, put them into the 0 to 1 UV space, leave a little bit of room on the edges, and we should be good to go. Now in this particular case, what I'll probably do is straighten this out. So if you don't want to do the scaling method on the Y or the X axis to zero this out, you can hit W and you can click Align Auto, which will do it for you. So just select a loop and then select Align Auto and make sure this is going all the way across like this, and that you have all of the correct loops selected. So it looks like, let me turn the stretch off there. We've got some interesting things happening with this portion of the mesh. So not sure what is going on there. But it looks like, okay, this needs to actually be here. So, oh, weird. Okay, so not sure what's going on there. Let's straighten this section. Now we know this is overlapping because this is brighter, so we need to move this up and above, and then straighten this. And that selected all the way around, so we need to not do that. Just want to straighten this bottom row here. Okay, now that should be lined up correctly for us. And we can kind of reposition all of this stuff so that it is in place. I'm not too worried about this bottom row, whatever this is, because it's not really going to be seen. But I want to make sure that if we can, we tuck things in correctly so that there's no stretching. Same thing here. I'm going to be using pretty much just a flat image of a stamp that I've scanned in for this. So the less we have this stretching out, the better this is going to look and less distorted it's going to be when we texture this. So looks like we're still good all the way across. So let's make that our final UV map for this object. So what I want to do now is I want to get the original UVs on this. I don't want to use. And what I was planning on doing was actually using the same UV texture map for all of the paper objects, at least for these 3 paper objects. And so I'm going to have to rethink kind of what I'm doing there now that I'm using this one. But what I can do basically is say, we know we have the UV maps selected here for the ticket and postcard. And I've got the same UV map created for this object. So if we jump into edit mode and I look at that, you can see that it is also mapped out here. And what I did was there's an add-on that you can turn on that is called Texture Atlas. And I believe this is bundled with Blender right now. And basically what it is configured to do is allow you to map out multiple objects in one texture map. And so if you select more than one object, and then you say you want to jump in here and start a manual unwrap, it will basically allow you to create a custom UV space that is shared between two objects. And so let's say I jump over here, and I'm gonna get rid of the texture atlas that is there. I'll just name this texture atlas, and I say I'm gonna start a manual unwrap. What that's gonna do is connect both of these into one object and merge them. So now I can see all of the texture space for both UV maps from both objects in one space and plan this out accordingly. So I can position several objects in one space here and then save that one UV layout to paint up in Photoshop or whatever I'm gonna do. And then what I can do is when I say finish manual unwrap, it's gonna separate those back out and they're gonna be grouped, and then they're gonna share that same texture atlas UV map here. And so as I jump into this one, you're only gonna see the UVs for the stamp object. And then as I jump into this one, you're only gonna see the UVs for the ticket object, but they're positioned still correctly so that I can use one image across all of the texture sets for those objects, and it'll save a lot of memory because I won't have to load in, you know, if there's 3 or 4 texture maps for one object, then that's 4 textures that are all 2K probably. And, you know, if that was a 2K image for each object, you know, it exponentially grows. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to that kind of as we get in here and play. So let's move this up a little bit. So this has the UV map that I currently want to use. And it looks like I already went in and named this one ticket postcard because I wanted to be able to use this and this object on the same layer. But I also now have this stamp object I want to add in here. So we've got to figure out a way to combine this into this proper map over here. So what I will probably do is one of the things we can look at is this is using the object data for this right here, ticket postcard merged object 02. This is an 03. And so what we might do is just switch this over to the 03 object. And now it's going to start using all the object data, which is going to include the same UV map that we just modified. So now if I get rid of this, it's going to keep this object here using the same object data. And it's already positioned in the correct place. We don't have to worry about transferring UVs or doing any of the other stuff because we just basically replaced the object that was sitting in that position. So the only other thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to map all 3 of these. And what I like to kind of do first is get each of these unwrapped correctly. And then I would do the texture atlas thing where I merge all of them together and then start playing with how to position them in one single layout because otherwise it can get really confusing trying to do it all simultaneously. So I just kind of do it one at a time. But before we wrap up tonight, let's take a look at some other objects that are a little bit more complicated than just the tickets over here. So we've got this one, and again, all of the UV unwrapping, you know, would imply that we're going to be doing more texture mapping, maybe in Substance or Photoshop. So that's the whole purpose of it. If you don't need to do any more stuff that's outside of Blender, or you think you can pull it off procedurally, you don't need the texture, you don't need to UV unwrap. But in this case, let's say we want to. So for this type of object, it's easiest if you break it down by sort of bigger primitive shapes and then determine how you're going to combine those back up. and utilize the space effectively. And so obviously bigger surfaces on the object are going to show more detail. You need to have more space on the UV map because it's going to use more pixels in the image. And then smaller sections like the handle need to be smaller, and especially areas that are like inside right here that you're not going to ever see, like the inside of the handle, don't need to be taking up huge portions of the texture map. As well as, you know, things that are hidden inside behind these walls don't really need to take priority on the texture map. So just think about that as you are going along. I'll show you kind of what it looks like if we just try to unwrap this as is. If we just hit unwrap, it's not going to give you anything useful. You can try to use cube projection. You're going to get a mess. Same thing with cylindrical. The interesting thing about cylindrical projections and some of these other options, spherical projections, is that you have options here for how to project this. So sometimes it will actually work really well. It just depends on what kind of object you have selected. So right now it's set to view on equator. You can view it on the poles, which will change where it starts to unwrap. Align to object, which you can see it didn't do a terrible job in terms of the middle part of this object. The surface is actually kind of laid out relatively well, but it's you know, one option of many. You've also got spherical projection, which is not going to give you tons more useful stuff there. There's also an option down here for switching which polar axis you want to align to. But most people typically stick with something like Smart UV. This will give you a workable UV map for pretty much any kind of object you throw at it. The problem is that if you're going to be painting something in Photoshop where you're going to be manually going in and trying to touch things up, you're worried about seams. And so the problem with this is that you're introducing tons of seams because Blender is automatically trying to calculate based on number of angles as it wraps around an object where to make those seams happen, and it's not intelligent, so it's just going to pick random places. So technically you can bake a normal map from this and it will turn out, but I try to do something a little bit more clean to begin with. Some people like to start with this method and then start just connecting things together. And so they would use the same principle that we were just talking about with welding these vertices. So if you hit V under any vertice that you select, it will show you the corresponding vertice on the mesh that is shared, because as you'll remember, if we're in vertex mode, any vertice that you select shares 4 faces on all sides. And so that means that on the UV unwrap, any vertice has 3 other brothers and sisters somewhere on this this layout, because everything's been split up somewhere. So anything that has a seam and has 1 face on it connected has 3 other faces somewhere that it connects to. So if you hit V, you're going to see where that connects up to the other 3 faces. So what some people will do is they'll start with a portion of the mesh that is in relatively good shape, and then they will start connecting things, which will automatically move those sections in the UV layout and stitch them together. And then you can just kind of manually let it kind of put things in place where it needs to go. And you can get it close here, and then again you would just weld to kind of match those together on a manual basis. And the only way this command will work, which I need to actually tell you what command this is, it's called stitch. This will only work if it's like a clean connection. And so if it's not, it's going to give you a little red indication, which tells you that that is not going to do what you want it to do. So one of the options you have is to hit M, which will switch midpoints to on and allow you to average the distance between those two. And so that's one of the ways that sometimes that will fix that for you. And if it doesn't work, you've always got the ability to just weld. So you can move them relatively close, hit weld, and it's the exact same thing as merging in the 3D viewport down here. Now, the one thing you want to keep in mind as you're doing this is, again, if you're manually moving stuff around, you're going to start stretching stuff. So this is the downside of manually doing the UV unwrap and kind of doing it this way. So what I like to do is I like to use seams to help me kind of manually break this up. And I start with stuff that I know is not going to really be seen. And since I'm mostly doing 3D illustration stuff, the camera angles are somewhat fixed. So I can usually pick some edge loops that are going to be well hidden. And you can tell from our camera angle, we're not really going to be able to see inside of this handle on the edges too often. So I will be able to repair these seams, but these are good places to hide them because typically you're not going to see these. So what I will do is make sure I have all of this connected. I'm going to mark the seams. That's going to basically cut those sections there. You would need a way to connect those up and around. And so then what I would do is, again, look through the camera, see if there's a section that I'm really not going to see. And if we look down at the bottom of the handle down here, this loop that goes around and underneath down here, you're not really going to see from the camera angle. So that will then cut this in half and kind of stretch this out a little bit. And when I get it to where I've got a couple of seams added in, what I like to do is start an unwrap and just kind of see what's going on with it. So if we unwrap this now, you can see with just this handle so far, kind of what we're working with. So we've got a decent unwrap going. Not too sure if there's anything that we need to fix yet. We got some overlaps there we can correct. Check the stretch a little bit. Got a little bit of stretching. So one of the things we can do is actually kind of massage these vertices into place. If we look at our modes here, we've got paint and mask that we can use to help us. You've also got options in here as well. So let's take a look at, we got proportional edit we can use. And yeah, let's take a look at some of these other options. So let's take a look at the brush settings here. This looks like it's for image painting. There is another thing that you can use. UV Sculpt, here it is. So when you turn UV Sculpt on under options over here, and that's just the T key, the way it always is in Blender, you're able to kind of left click and drag and move these points around the way you would in sculpt mode or whatever. So that's kind of an interesting way to edit your object here. So we can do that, and that can be really useful in trying to play with what is stretching your object and how you might be able to fix it. And so sometimes if you need to move a big section of vertices around, this is easier than trying to do it manually. You've got live unwrap that you can turn on there, which will help a little bit. But anyways, so a lot of options in here that can help you as you UV unwrap. And then there is the option we talked about last night, which is adding in an image like this, which will let you see how this is looking in your 3D viewport. So if you switch this over to material and actually textured, but you have to have this selected in your node editor as well. Add a texture, image texture. There we go. So now with this selected over here, we'll be able to see if there's any stretching in the 3D viewport. So there's going to be a seam where we cut the objects. It's taking the subsurf into account, so you're going to see a little bit of deviation there. But we're got a little bit of a seam happening. And down here, I'm not too worried about it, but it could become an issue if it's too visible in here. So we'll just have to decide as we're painting if that's going to be a problem. I think for the most part, that'll be okay, especially from a distance. So let's take a look at some of the other sections over here. I'm going to hide the handle. Let's go back to solid mode. And we've got 3 main sections here. We've got this sort of spout section at the top. We have basically a giant cylinder in the middle, and then the bottom is going to give us a little bit of a different issue because it's got a cap on it. And so the easiest thing to do is just to create a seam down here on this cap, and I might do it out here. And then that's going to just basically flatten that out like it's a flat object. So we can switch this down to the bottom, hit L to select out to that seam with seam selected over here. And then what we can do is just project from this view. So if we go to project from view, that's going to basically just copy what we see in the 3D viewport for our UVs. And if you're dealing with an object that's relatively flat, this works really, really well. And so now we can just kind of rotate this into place and pick a size that is decent for the object. Here we're not really going to ever see the bottom, so it doesn't need to take up a lot of the UV space, but we'll kind of get that out of the way. And then once again, as you go, just jump into textured mode and preview what that looks like. So you don't want to have more squares on the bottom than on something else on the vase or the little pitcher that is actually showing texture, because again, you're never going to see underneath, at least for this project. So what I would want to do is scale this way down and then put it in the corner over here. So I hope that makes sense. And it will as you kind of work on your own projects, but let's cut off the top over here. So I'm going to make sure I'm on the outside of this object. Let's mark a seam. I'm also going to mark a seam right about here on the inside lip, because again, we're not going to be too worried about that. I might rethink that. Let's just see what happens so far here. So anything that I've UV'd, we're going to select and hide it. So let's select everything here. Let's unwrap. Kind of see what's going on. So everything on the inside that doesn't have seams yet is obviously going to be total mess because it doesn't know how to unwrap that. So you're going to have to kind of get in here and figure out how to cut this up so that it will unfold and lay flat in a really simple way. But this is the outside of the section that we just added a seam to. So if I grab those pieces, you can see those laying out flat. And now we need to kind of figure out what we're going to do here. So this is the inside of our mesh. And I'm going to do the same thing I just did on this outside piece, on this inside piece. I'm going to cut the bottom away so that we have a loop running all the way around the inside, and mark a seam. And then everything on the inside down here, we're just going to project from this viewport. Move that out of the way. Put it down here. And again, we're not even really going to see this. So even if they're kind of stacked on top of each other, it's not really going to be a problem if they're sharing the same texture, because we're not ever really going to see them. So this is sort of where you start to figure out how to save yourself some time and effort based on the purpose of your objects, and why it's so important to be able to do this manually for every object that you're creating in Blender. because if you just rely on automatic unwrap for everything, then you miss out on ways to save memory and time and get better texturing results and stuff like that. So let's see what else we got. So when you start unwrapping a lot of stuff, it can be kind of difficult to tell what you got left to work on. And so that's when I switch on this button to let me grab all the sections that's part of an island, and that tells me, so this is the interior right here. The interior all the way to the outside exterior. And so we need to go down to probably around in here. Let's mark another seam. So that's a clean cut all the way through. Let's grab just this top section where these seams go from the outside all the way up and around and down into the inside. And then let's unwrap that by itself. And I'm also going to unwrap on the tip over here. So starting with where that seam starts at the bottom, we're going to add a seam up these edges and over to here. And let's mark a seam. Let's see what this does. Okay. So you want to turn this off when you're playing around 3D in the UV space for moving things around, because it's going to make it really, really hard to select and move things when you're doing that. That looks decent. I think we got some overlaps we need to play with here. But other than that, I think that's going to be clean enough for our purposes. So now let's reselect everything. I'm not sure what this is. Got some things to play with there. This is all part of the handle. So again, now that we know kind of what sizes we're dealing with for the rest of the object, we don't need to make these huge, but I'm going to wait to scale these down until we get through kind of playing with the rest of this object. I'm going to go ahead and move the bottom of our little picture out of the way. This is the rest of the body. I don't know what this is, so let's take a look at this object. Okay, so this one, we could even try doing a cylindrical projection. It's going to be pretty clean. So if we just look at what we have here, move that off to the side, you can see we don't really have any issues here. It's pretty much just laid out as a grid for us. So once you break it down into simpler shapes, it gets easier and easier to use these basic unwrap methods. And eventually you'll run out of stuff to unwrap. So then you just have to figure out how to lay it out in a big puzzle on the UV space over here. All right, so let's look at this. Okay, that looks like it's only the interior. Yeah. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna invert the selection in my 3D viewport, and I'm gonna hide so I can just see the interior of this vase. And then I'm gonna do the same thing I just did the outside. I'm gonna do a cylindrical unwrap. And yeah, so that it's clean as well. So let's unhide everything. And we've still got a little bit of something not showing up, or that's not been unwrapped correctly. So let's look at whatever we have left over here. Okay, so it's just this ring running around the outside edge down here. So this actually could be part of this section up here. So maybe I just need to select all of that. Yeah, let's try that. And then let's retry a cylindrical unwrap. And that should connect all of those together for us. Okay, so that's everything. Now we just need to decide how we're going to kind of lay this out in the UV space here. So these are the least important. They can be shoved into the corner because you're never going to see these. The container is always going to be full of something, so not super important. This is the inside, which again is not going to be super important, so we don't need to give it a lot of space because we're not going to paint the inside. So this is going to be down here at the bottom. And then this is going to be the outside top, and this is going to be the exterior, which is going to get most of the attention. So this needs to end up taking up most of the room here. And then now we can figure out where to kind of shove this stuff into place. And so again, anywhere we can squeeze in a couple of extra pixels, we want to try. So we're going to do that there. Let's select both of these sections down here. And again, I'm going to make these even smaller because they are not important. This big outside section needs to fit somewhere in here. So we're going to have to kind of play a little bit with the UV grid to see if it's matching up enough with scale to get that all in one map. But until then, this should be good enough for now. So we've got some overlapping lines we're going to want to play with here. Okay, I think that is good. Let's do one more check for the stretching. So angle stretching will tell you as it's wrapping or trying to unwrap your shape, how much distortion it's getting based on trying to lay it out flat. Area distortion will tell you how much distortion you're getting based on differences in scale. So if there's massive differences in certain parts of the mesh, you're going to see a lot more red compared to what it should be in terms of scale relative to all the other polygons in the 3D viewport. And that's also handy to look at. So the handle might be something we need to look at in terms of how to scale this correctly. You're going to get major notifications down here for problems because, again, we're scaling these way down. But if I were to scale this back up till it's about blue, we would know that it's about the same appropriate scale for the bottom edge of our where this connects up here. This also tells me that this is upside down. So let's rotate this 180 degrees. And I'm going to scale this back down. Try to line them up sort of on top of each other. That way we're not wasting any space. Okay, so one of the things we could do here is use our proportional edit to kind of play with this a little bit and see if we can fix some of this. So I'm going to move it away from everything else. Let's grab these two vertices in here, turn on our proportional edit with O, and then we can play with scaling this until it is about the right size. So it looks like we would have to get it about this big before it's an appropriate size here. And not sure I want to go that small, but we can play it with it a little bit. One of the other things you can do, obviously, is select everything and hit Control A, which will average the scales appropriately automatically. And that may be a good place to start if you're trying to line all this stuff up. So maybe pay attention to that. We do have both of these sections laying on top of each other. Or actually, no, we don't. One's down here, so I thought we did. All right, let's look manually and see if we are happy with where these are lining up. And then I will decide if we need to play with any of the distortion. So let's reselect our ticket texture over here in the node editor. Jump into textured view. And now we can kind of see what's going on here. So it looks like I accidentally swapped these, the big one for the small one. So this one actually needs to be small and this one needs to be big. So let's scale this one up quite a bit. Scale this one down and put it back down here. This is why we check to make sure that we're dealing with the right UVs. And now we can kind of see all over if things are appropriately sized. We don't want a lot of stretching. If you're getting a lot of distortion with the numbers and everything, especially in a cylindrical object, all you really have to do is scale along the x-axis. So here we would scale wider to square up these UV coordinates. And then we can, again, shrink this back down, but that will lower the distortion there. We then also want to make sure that the numbers, squares, and everything on the handle are kind of the same size as they are in the surrounding areas, because if we're painting dirt or things like that, and these aren't the same scale, then we're going to see much more detail in these areas where the squares are getting small, and much less detail in these areas where the squares are getting big. So that's not going to be good. So scale that down a little bit. Okay, might go with something like that. And once you start getting more than one island kind of scaled appropriately, you can kind of group them together and scale them simultaneously. That way you're making sure that you're keeping these the same scale as you go. And this inside section right here is what we see there. So if I were to invert, hide everything, and then unhide, we may want to split this again. So if we look at maybe adding in another seam down here, we can mark that seam and then unwrap again. And that's going to make that a linear unwrap for us. Let's unhide everything and see where we're at. Okay. So again, I want these squares to match about the same as the squares over there. So we're going to have to find a creative way to rotate these into place. So that's sort of close. I think that's going to be okay. These aren't too bad, but we've got way smaller squares up towards the top. So that's the section up here that we need to play with a little bit. Maybe it's the section right here. Let's turn on proportional edit. Yeah. It's a little better. Okay, I think we're getting there. Yeah, that's better. So now you can see that from the side of the little pot here all the way to the handle, with the exception of right around here, all of the squares are kind of the same size, which is, again, what we're going for here. And so then we just need to keep doing this for the other sections. So this top area needs to have larger squares. Maybe about like that. Okay, so now that we've got everything kind of sized appropriately, we need to kind of put these back together in a way that is going to maximize the room, and then see if we can figure out a way to scale this back up. So we're not going to get a lot of room to play with here. But you can see by manually kind of packing this in and taking the time to do this, you're going to get more squares overall kind of jammed into the texture space, which means that you can have high resolution textures, better looking normals, all of that sort of stuff. And eventually, when you get finished with all of that, you know, that's the whole goal here, is to get everything kind of looking good. So you want undistorted textures. You don't want any rectangles. You want squares. So in the middle here, we've got some things we need to kind of work on. So let's select this. Looks like we can just move these kind of up and down to compensate. We need to decide whether or not that is a problem up and down or kind of left and right. So using proportional edit, we need to kind of see what that needs to look like. Okay, so I'm mostly concerned with these areas right here. So if I were to select this face, we're looking at this area right here. So let's start here with this row and then see what needs to happen. Do we need to come in? It looks like it's stretching it the wrong way, so we need to move out a little bit more until these square up here, like that. And then on this other side, let's start here and figure out what we need to do. So we're going to start this section down here, turn off proportional edit, and let's just play with what we need to do. Okay, maybe pull those in just a little bit. Just like this. Okay, so a little better. And there we go. Now we've got a properly UV'd little pot here or whatever, and don't really know the name for this. I just called it creamer before, but you can see how much difference there is on the inside. The UVs are huge, distorted, doesn't really matter. Again, we have an object that is covering the inside of this, like up till here, so not super important. But now we can take this into Substance and do the same exact thing that we did earlier tonight, dirty this thing up, and then get back into Blender and play some more with that. So Lauren's asking, do we need to worry about that scaling uniformity matching between all the objects in the scene or just within each object individually? And so it's more about the scale for each object individually because it's sharing a texture map. And so all the pixels on the texture map, you know, it's about, you know, 100 pixels by 100 pixels on this part of the map matching 100 pixels by 100 pixels on this part of the map. And so what you'll run into is if you have some sections that are really, really largely covering the texture map in the UV space, and then you have other sections of the model that are only covering part of the section in the corner, that corner section is going to get really blurred when you try to load the texture map back in because there's just not enough resolution there to show a proper texture. And it's the same exact idea when you're taking pictures with your camera, right? The more megapixels you have, the better your camera is at taking detail. And so we're trying to jam as many pixels into that area as we can. And so it's all relative. So remember that as we look at the UV space for this layout, that's 0 down here in the bottom left-hand corner and 1 up here in the upper right-hand corner is a relative scale. So this could be a 1K texture. This entire range could be a 2K texture. This entire range could be a 3K, 4K, 5K, 6K, 8K, whatever it is. And doesn't matter how many pixels are in this this map. What matters is how you utilize the pixels that are there, because a really good texture artist can take half as much resolution, and because they're so good at UV unwrapping and scaling and matching and configuring the layout, they can jam enough data into the same area and not be wasteful with it. And so it all comes down to, if you have leftover UV space, is there another object that you could share a map with, put things in the same area, and things like that. And in our case, we've got some overlapping sections here. We don't want that. We want to cover that up. I might even be able to squeeze in another object. So in this case, this is a ceramic-based object. And if there's another ceramic-based object in the scene, like the plate, and that doesn't have too much space that's needed, I could put that in the same texture map. I think I'm not going to be able to pull that off, but what I'll probably do is spend some more time configuring and rearranging all these islands and see if I can create a better layout here to maximize more of this space. And that will allow me to spend a lot more time adding detail into the entire area, instead of just, you know, again, taking all of the main section here and cramming it down in the corner, and all of the beautiful stuff that we do in Substance isn't going to transfer over because it's going to look blurry and pixelated and ugh, gross. So yeah, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed tonight. Go back and watch the stream. It's going to be up tonight if you missed it. All of my streams are uploaded on the YouTube channel. I am in the process of adding them all back into the orangeguild.com, so that anybody who is a member can go back and watch all of those from the Orange Guild without having to go to YouTube. We're going to keep continuing this over tonight. We obviously talked about texturing, UV unwrapping. Last night we talked about getting in here and playing with the pipe and some sculpting tips, things like that. Tomorrow night is a wildcard night, so show up tomorrow night and see what we talk about. I'm going to think of something fun that we can do. It's a little bit off topic and will be an interesting deviation from the regular project that we're working on here. But if you guys want more UV tips, or you want more texturing tips, or more Substance, or whatever you want, let me know in the comments. And I answer every comment. I look at every comment, and I really value you guys' feedback on my teaching skills and what you want to hear from me in terms of what helps you the best, because this is really about you and helping you guys level up your skills, get to whatever you're trying to do next in Blender or anything. And so thank you guys for joining me. Tomorrow night, I'll be back at 7 p.m. Central Time on the YouTube channel right here. And definitely subscribe, like the video, please, and leave me a comment. Let me know what you got from it and what you're working on, and I'd love to talk to you about it. Until then, I'll see you guys tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Hang loose and stay cool out there.